Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. My name is Tyler Whitehorse, and I've been running the night shift at Faith's only Dollar Tree for 8 months now. Before you ask, yes, that Faith. The one with a population that hovers around 421, depending on who's counting, and whether the Bergman family has fled to Rapid City for another extended vacation. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, and the Lakota reservation boundary runs so close you can see the prairie grass shift color where treaty lines were drawn. I ended up here after my discharge from Fort Carson. Military police doesn't translate well to civilian life, turns out. My sister Marlena had been pestering me to move closer to home ever since Dad's funeral. And when she mentioned that old Harvey Kerner needed someone reliable for the graveyard shift at his Dollar Tree, it seemed like fate. $12 an hour to stock shelves and ring up late-night purchases in the town, where the most exciting thing that happens is when the high school football team makes it past the first playoff round. What Marlena didn't mention, what nobody mentions when you're new to Faith, is why Harvey needed someone for the night shift in the first place. Why the previous guy, Danny Elkhorn, quit without giving notice. Why customers sometimes come in at 2 a.m. asking for specific items and voices that don't quite match their faces. Faith sits in a pocket of the Great Plains, where the wind carries more than just the scent of sweet grass and cattle. The Lakota have stories about this stretch of land, stories that predate the town by centuries. Stories about things that learned to wear human shapes, but never quite perfected the act. My first clue something was off came during my second week. A woman walked in around 3:15 a.m., pale, probably mid-30s, wearing a sundress despite the October frost. She moved through the aisles like she was sleepwalking, picking up random items and setting them down in different spots. A pack of AA batteries in the greeting card section. Canned peaches with the automotive supplies. When she finally approached my register, she held out a crumpled $5 bill and asked for the usual. I had no idea what her usual was, but something in her glassy stare made me ring up a single pack of birthday candles. She nodded once, took the candles, and walked straight out into the parking lot. I watched through the window as she got into a rusted Chevy pickup and drove north toward the reservation. The weird part? Her license plate was from 1987. That's when Harvey showed up the next morning with a wrinkled piece of paper covered in his shaky handwriting. Rules for the night shift, he called them. 23 specific instructions that seemed random at first, until I realized they weren't suggestions. They were survival tactics. Harvey's hands shook as he handed me the list. Danny lasted 4 months before he broke, he said. You seem steadier. Military training might help. He paused at the door, looking back with eyes that had seen too much. Faith's got its own way of testing people, Tyler. These rules aren't about the job. They're about making it through the night. I should have walked away then. But $12 an hour was $12 an hour. And I had seen worse things in Afghanistan than small-town weirdness. Or so I thought. The rules Harvey handed me were written on the back of old receipt paper, the kind that yellows at the edges and smells faintly of thermal ink. His handwriting was cramped, like he'd been trying to fit too many thoughts into too little space. Faith Dollar Tree, night shift. Protocols. Rule 1, lock the front door at exactly 11:47 p.m. Not 11:45, not 11:50. The town clock chimes at 11:46. Wait for it to finish. Rule 2, if someone knocks after hours, check their reflection in the security monitor first. If their reflection moves differently than they do, ignore the knocking completely. Rule 3, never stock the back corner of aisle 7 after midnight. The greeting cards there rearrange themselves anyway. Rule 4. When the phone rings 3 times, then stops, unplug it. Don't plug it back in until you see headlights pass by going east. Rule 5. The elderly Lakota woman who comes in for salt always pays with exact change. Count it twice. If there's an extra penny, leave it on the counter overnight. The list went on. 23 rules total, each more bizarre than the last. I folded the paper and slipped it into my shirt pocket, figuring Harvey was just eccentric. Small towns breed that kind of quirky behavior. My 3rd night alone, I learned he wasn't eccentric at all. The store felt different after dark. During day shifts, Dollar Tree was just another retail box. Fluorescent lighting, cramped aisles, the persistent smell of cardboard and Chinese plastic. But once the sun disappeared behind the grain elevator on Main Street, something shifted. The building seemed to settle differently, like it was exhaling after holding its breath all day. I was restocking the pharmacy section around 10:30 when I noticed the greeting cards in aisle 7 rustling. No air circulation back there, no reason for movement. I walked over to investigate, flashlight in hand since 2 of the overhead bulbs had been flickering for weeks. The cards hung on metal pegs in neat rows, birthday wishes, sympathy notes, generic thinking of you designs. But as I watched, they began rotating on their hangers. Slow, purposeful turns. A happy anniversary card spun to face the wall. A condolence card flipped upside down. Within minutes, every card in the back corner displayed blank white backs instead of colorful fronts. I grabbed one and flipped it over. The front side was completely empty. No text, no images, just smooth cardstock the color of bone. "What the hell?" I whispered, reaching for another card. My phone buzzed. Text from Harvey. "Following the rules yet?" I looked at my watch. 11:44 p.m. The rules said to lock up at 11:47, wait for the town clock to chime at 11:46. I'd been so focused on the cards that I'd nearly missed it. Racing to the front, I grabbed my keys and waited. The old courthouse clock began its nightly ritual, 11 deep bongs echoing across the empty streets. On the final chime, I turned the deadbolt. 3 seconds later, someone tried the door handle. I stepped back, watching through the glass. A figure stood just outside the pool of light cast by our parking lot lamp. Average height, wearing what looked like a winter coat, despite the mild October weather. They tried the handle again, more insistently this time. Rule 2 flashed through my mind. Check their reflection in the security monitor first. Hey! The black and white screen above the registers showed the front entrance clearly. The figure stood there, hand on the door handle, but their reflection was doing something else entirely. While the person outside appeared to be pulling on the door, their reflection was waving at the camera. I watched, mesmerized, as the reflection began pointing toward the back of the store, while the actual figure continued yanking on the locked door. Then the knocking started, slow, rhythmic taps against the glass. The reflection never moved its hands. I forced myself to turn away from the monitor and focus on my closing duties. Stock the pharmacy shelves, count the register, update the inventory log. Normal tasks to keep my hands busy, while something that wasn't quite human tried to get my attention outside. The knocking continued for 20 minutes before finally stopping. When I looked at the monitor again, both the figure and its mismatched reflection were gone. My phone rang at 12:15 a.m. 3 sharp rings, then silence. I stared at it, Harvey's 4th rule echoing in my memory. Unplug it. Don't plug it back in until headlights pass going east. The phone cord came out of the wall socket with a soft pop. Now I had to wait for eastbound traffic, which could take hours in a town like Faith. Most folks were asleep by 10 p.m., and the highway ran north-south anyway. I settled in behind the counter with a Mountain Dew and a bag of stale pretzels, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Military training had taught me to trust my observations, but nothing in Afghanistan had prepared me for reflections with minds of their own. Around 1:30 a.m., a pair of headlights finally swept past the store, heading toward the reservation. I plugged the phone back in, half expecting it to immediately ring again. Instead, it stayed silent for the rest of my shift. When Harvey arrived at 6 a.m. to relieve me, he took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. "You met one of them," he said. It wasn't a question. "What are they?" Harvey hung his coat on the peg behind the counter. "Wish I knew for sure. Been happening since they built this store, though. Maybe before that even. The Lakota have words for things that pretend to be human." He paused, studying the security monitor where normal morning traffic was beginning to appear. "Your people probably know more about it than mine." I wanted to ask more questions, but Harvey was already shooing me toward the door. "Get some sleep, Tyler. Tomorrow night might be worse." As I drove home, the morning sun painting the prairie grass gold, I couldn't shake the image of that mismatched reflection, or Harvey's casual mention of your people. I was only 1/4 Lakota, but apparently that was enough for Faith to notice. I spent the next day researching Faith's history at the public library, a converted railroad depot that smelled like old paper and radiator heat. Mrs. Hartwell, the librarian, was helpful enough until I started asking about the Dollar Tree's location. "Used to be Peterson's 5 and Dine," she said, suddenly busy with filing returned books. "Before that, empty lot. Nothing special about it." But her eyes shifted toward the Lakota history section when she said it, and I caught the hint. The tribal records were more forthcoming. The land where the store sat had been a traditional crossing point, a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin during certain times of year. European settlers had avoided building there until the 1960s, when Peterson's grandfather decided the Indian superstitions were keeping prime real estate off the market. Peterson's 5 and Dine burned down in 1987. No clear cause, but 3 employees had quit in the months leading up to the fire, all citing strange customers and things that didn't add up. The lot stayed empty until Dollar Tree's corporate expansion reached rural South Dakota in 2019. I showed up for my 4th night shift, armed with this knowledge and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Maybe not the best expression under the circumstances. The evening started normally. A few customers trickled in before closing, teenagers buying energy drinks, an elderly rancher picking up motor oil, a young mother grabbing diapers and formula, regular people with regular needs. At 11:47, I locked the door and settled in for another weird night in Faith. She arrived at 1:23 a.m. I heard the footsteps first, soft, careful steps on the sidewalk outside. Then a gentle tap on the glass door, not the insistent knocking from the night before. I looked up from my inventory sheets to see an elderly Lakota woman standing patiently by the entrance. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with gray hair braided down her back, and a blue wool coat that looked handmade. Her face was weathered like old leather, and her dark eyes held the kind of patience that comes from seeing decades pass, like seasons. Rule 5 flashed through my mind. The elderly Lakota woman who comes in for salt always pays with exact change. Count it twice. If there's an extra penny, leave it on the counter overnight. I unlocked the door. "Evening, grandmother," I said in Lakota, using the respectful term my dad had taught me. Her face brightened. "Ah, Harvey finally hired someone with sense. You're White Horse's boy, aren't you? You have his eyes. You knew my father?" Knew your grandfather better. Good man. Understood the old ways. She stepped inside, moving with the steady gait of someone who'd walked countless miles across prairie grass. I'm Agnes Crowfeather. I come for salt. I led her to aisle 3, where the table salt and kosher salt shared space with spices and baking supplies. Agnes examined the options carefully before selecting 3 containers of Morton salt, the plain white cylinders with the girl under the umbrella. Grandmother, if you don't mind me asking, why do you shop so late? Agnes looked at me with eyes that seemed much older than her face. Same reason you work so late, grandson. Some things only move in the dark. At the register, she counted out exact change. $4.77. 3 singles, 7 quarters, and 2 pennies. I counted it twice, as the rules specified. The math was perfect. The salt helps, she said as I bagged her purchase. Sprinkle it around your house before dawn. Keep the lines clear. Lines? Boundaries. Between what belongs here and what doesn't. She paused at the door. Your grandfather knew about boundaries. Made sure your father learned too. Shame it didn't pass down complete. After she left, I found myself staring at the register, thinking about her words. My dad had never mentioned anything about supernatural boundaries, but he'd been full of what I dismissed as old-fashioned superstitions. Don't whistle at night. Never point at graves. Always leave tobacco for the spirits when crossing certain places. Maybe they weren't superstitions. The phone rang at 2:15 a.m. 3 sharp rings, then silence. I unplugged it and went back to restocking the candy aisle, waiting for eastbound headlights. That's when I noticed the man browsing the automotive section. I hadn't heard him come in, which should have been impossible since the front door chimed whenever it opened. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that looked normal enough. Dark hair, clean-shaven, probably in his 30s. Nothing obviously wrong with him. Except he'd been in the same spot for 20 minutes, holding the same bottle of windshield washer fluid, and I couldn't hear him breathing. I watched him from behind the register, pretending to organize receipt rolls while keeping one eye on aisle 6. He stood perfectly still, like a mannequin, the blue bottle frozen in his right hand. My military training kicked in. Assess the threat. Plan an escape route. Trust your instincts. My instincts were screaming. I pulled out Harvey's rules and scanned them quickly. Nothing specifically about customers who didn't breathe, but Rule 7 caught my attention. If someone stands in the same spot for more than 15 minutes without moving, announce that the store is closed for inventory. They should leave. If they don't, call this number, 605-555-0847. The number looked local. I grabbed the store phone, still unplugged, and considered my options. I could plug it back in and make the call, but Rule 4 said not to reconnect it until I saw eastbound headlights. Breaking one rule to follow another seemed like a dangerous precedent. "Excuse me," I called out instead. "Store is closed for inventory." The man didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. "Sir, we're closed." Still nothing. The bottle of washer fluid remained suspended in his grip, defying gravity and logic. I decided to risk plugging the phone back in. Whatever was standing in aisle 6 felt like a bigger threat than violating Rule 4. The number rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Agnes here?" "Mrs. Crowfeather? This is Tyler from the Dollar Tree. I have a situation." The tall one in flannel. "How did you—" "I'm 3 blocks away. I'll be right there." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, wondering how Agnes had known exactly what kind of help I needed. 5 minutes later, she knocked on the door. I let her in. noting that she carried a small leather pouch in her left hand. "Where is he?" she asked. I pointed toward aisle 6. Agnes nodded and walked purposefully toward the automotive section, her footsteps echoing in the quiet store. "You don't belong here," she said to the motionless figure. The man's head turned, not smoothly, but in quick, jerky movements like a bird. When he faced us, I saw that his eyes were completely black, reflecting the store's overhead lighting like wet stones. "Store policy says I can browse," he replied. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Agnes opened her leather pouch and scattered something across the floor. Coarse white crystals that looked like rock salt mixed with crushed bone. "Store policy doesn't apply to things that don't need to buy anything," she said calmly. The man thing took a step backward, and I heard the windshield washer fluid bottle hit the floor. The sound echoed wrong, like it had fallen much farther than 3 feet. "The boy called the police," Agnes lied smoothly. "They'll be here soon." For the first time since I'd noticed him, the creature showed genuine reaction. His face contorted, features shifting like clay being reshaped by invisible hands. "This isn't over," he said, and walked toward the back of the store. I expected him to try the emergency exit, but instead, he simply faded, not disappearing, but becoming less solid with each step until he was gone entirely. Agnes gathered up her salt mixture and tucked the pouch back into her coat. "What was that thing?" "Hungry?" she said. "They're always hungry. Been getting bolder lately, too." "How did you know I needed help?" She smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Salt creates more than boundaries, grandson. It carries messages, too. Old magic. Older than this town." After Agnes left, I sat behind the counter trying to process what I'd witnessed. The rules weren't just random instructions. They were part of a larger system, one that connected Harvey, Agnes, and probably others in Faith who understood what really moved through the darkness. Around 4 a.m., a pickup truck drove east past the store. I plugged the phone back in and finished my shift without further incident. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature's parting words weren't just a threat. They were a promise. I didn't sleep well after my encounter with the thing in aisle 6. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black, reflective pupils staring back at me. When I finally dozed off around noon, I dreamed of my grandfather, a man I'd only met twice before his death when I was 8. In the dream, he stood in a field of prairie grass that stretched to the horizon, wearing the same red flannel shirt I remembered from childhood visits. But his face was serious, lined with worry. "The hungry ones are testing you, Takoja," he said, using the Lakota word for grandson. "They know you carry the blood, but they're not sure if you carry the knowledge." "What knowledge?" "The boundaries are weakening. Too many people in Faith have forgotten the old agreements. The salt and the rules help, but they're not enough anymore." I woke up with his voice still echoing in my ears, and the taste of prairie dust in my mouth. That evening, I stopped by Agnes Crowfeather's house before my shift. She lived in a small white farmhouse on the edge of town, with a garden that somehow still bloomed despite the October frost. Wind chimes made from small bones hung from her porch, creating soft melodies that sounded almost like whispered words. "You look tired, grandson," she said, opening the door before I could knock. "Bad dreams about my grandfather." Her expression sharpened. "Joseph always was good at reaching across. Come in." Her living room was filled with the kind of furniture that survives decades. A worn leather couch, hand-carved wooden end tables, quilts draped over everything, But what caught my attention were the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the room had been covered with black cloth. Mirrors show too much in a house like this, Agnes explained, noticing my stare. Some things are better left unseen. She poured us both coffee from a pot that looked older than me, then settled into a rocking chair that creaked with familiar rhythm. "Your grandfather visited me 3 days ago," she said casually. "That's not possible. He died 15 years ago." Death doesn't stop everyone from visiting, especially those with unfinished business. She sipped her coffee, studying my face over the rim. "He's worried about you. Says the hungry ones are planning something bigger than usual." "What kind of something?" "The boundary crossing happens every October, when the veil grows thin. Usually it's just a few lost spirits wandering through, maybe something hungry looking for an easy meal. But this year..." She set down her cup, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. "This year, something's been calling them, gathering them." Agnes walked to an old cedar chest in the corner and pulled out a leather-bound journal filled with yellowed pages. "This belonged to your great-grandfather, Thomas Whitehorse. He helped the town founders make the original agreements back in 1923. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, some in English, some in Lakota syllabary. Sketches of symbols filled the margins, circles, lines, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. The agreements were meant to keep Faith safe," Agnes continued. "Certain locations were designated as crossing points, places where the spirits could pass through without harming the living. In exchange, the town would maintain the boundaries and respect the old ways. But people forgot. The crossing points got built over, the boundary markers removed. Now the spirits have nowhere safe to go, so they're making their own paths." She pointed to a map tucked between the journal pages. "Your Dollar Tree sits right on top of the main crossing point." I studied the map, noting how many of Faith's current businesses were built over what Thomas Whitehorse had marked as sacred locations. The courthouse, the gas station, even the high school. So, Harvey's rules are the only thing standing between Faith and a complete breakdown of the barriers. Harvey's grandfather was there in 1923. The rules got passed down, adapted for modern times. Agnes closed the journal and fixed me with a stare that seemed to look straight through to my soul. "But Harvey's getting old, and the rules aren't enough anymore. The spirits are getting desperate, and desperate spirits do dangerous things." I left Agnes's house with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that my night shift was about to become much more complicated. The Dollar Tree felt different when I arrived at 10 p.m. The air inside seemed thicker, charged with the kind of electric tension that comes before thunderstorms. Even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting shadows in corners where no shadows should exist. I ran through my opening routine, count the register, check the inventory sheets, review Harvey's rules one more time. But tonight I noticed something new. Rule 24, written in different ink at the bottom of the page. Rule 24. If you hear your name being called from the storage room, do not answer. Do not investigate. Turn the radio to 94.7 FM and leave it there until dawn. The rule was written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of adding it. My shift started quietly. A few regular customers came and went. Mrs. Peterson buying cleaning supplies, teenage Jake Hoffman grabbing snacks for a late study session, old Mr. Reeves picking up his weekly supply of Copenhagen, normal people doing normal things. At 11:47, I locked the door and began my real work. The first sign of trouble came at 12:30 a.m. when I heard footsteps in the storage room. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone wearing work boots. I checked the schedule. No deliveries expected, and Harvey never came in during night shifts. The footsteps continued, accompanied by the sound of boxes being moved around. Then I heard my name. Tyler. Clear as day, coming from behind the employee door. Tyler, can you help me back here? The voice sounded like Harvey, but Harvey was home asleep, and Rule 24 was very specific about not answering calls from the storage room. I walked to the radio behind the counter and tuned it to 94.7 FM. Static filled the store, but underneath the white noise I could hear something else. Soft chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Tyler, where are you? The voice was more insistent now, and it definitely sounded like Harvey. I need you to unlock the back door. I gripped the counter edge and forced myself to stay put. The chanting on the radio grew louder, drowning out the voice from the storage room. 20 minutes later, the footsteps stopped. At 1:15 a.m., the phone rang 3 times and went silent. I unplugged it and settled in to wait for eastbound headlights. That's when I noticed the customers. 3 people stood in different aisles, a middle-aged woman in aisle 2, a teenage boy in aisle 5, and an elderly man near the pharmacy. I hadn't heard them come in, which should have been impossible with the locked door and functioning door chime. The woman was reading the ingredients on a can of green beans, holding it close to her face like she was having trouble with the small print. The teenage boy stood frozen in front of the candy display, one hand reaching toward a pack of Skittles. The elderly man appeared to be examining cold medicine, but his head was tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. None of them were moving. None of them were breathing, and all 3 cast shadows that didn't match their positions. I pulled out Harvey's rules and scanned them quickly. Rule 11 seemed relevant. If more than 2 people entered the store simultaneously without making the door chime, they are not people. Turn off all the lights except the emergency exit signs. They will leave on their own. But there were 3 of them, and Rule 11 specifically said, more than 2. Did that mean the rule applied? Or was I dealing with something else entirely? I decided to trust the pattern. All the lights were controlled by a master switch behind the counter. I flipped it, plunging the store into near darkness except for the red glow of the exit signs. The effect was immediate and disturbing. All 3 figures began moving, not walking, but gliding across the floor like they were on invisible tracks. The woman in aisle 2 turned her head 180 degrees to look at me, her neck rotating with the soft sound of grinding bone. The teenage boy's mouth opened wider than humanly possible, revealing rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's jaw. The elderly man near the pharmacy began laughing, a sound like wind through dry leaves. They converged on the counter where I stood, moving in perfect synchronization. As they got closer, I could see that their eyes were the same bottomless black that I'd encountered the night before. Store policy says we can browse, the woman said in a voice that echoed from 3 throats simultaneously. Store's closed, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Store policy says, store policy doesn't apply to things that don't cast proper shadows, I interrupted, remembering Agnes's words. The 3 figures stopped moving. For a moment, the only sound in the store was the static from the radio and the hum of the refrigerated cases. Then they began to laugh, the same dry, rustling sound multiplied by 3. The sound grew louder, echoing off the walls and ceiling until it felt like the building itself was laughing. The boy learns quickly, they said in unison. But learning and surviving are different lessons. The laughter stopped abruptly. All 3 figures turned toward the front door and glided away, passing through the locked glass like it wasn't there. I turned the lights back on with shaking hands and tried to process what had just happened. 3 entities, clearly working together, testing my knowledge of the rules. But unlike the solitary creature from the night before, These things had seemed almost amused by my responses, like they were enjoying a game I didn't fully understand yet. The radio continued broadcasting its static and chanting until dawn, when I finally switched it back to the local country station. As the first rays of sunlight hit the parking lot, I found myself wondering how many more tests I'd have to pass before something decided I had failed, and what would happen when that moment came. A pickup truck drove east past the store at 5:30 a.m. I plugged the phone back in and finished my inventory, but my hands kept shaking as I wrote down stock numbers. When Harvey arrived at 6 a.m., he took one look at my face and nodded grimly. 3 of them this time? How did you know? Because it's getting close to Halloween, Tyler, and Halloween in Faith isn't like Halloween anywhere else. Halloween was 3 days away, and Faith felt like a town holding its breath. I noticed it first in the customers who came during evening hours, the way they moved faster through the aisles, grabbed what they needed without browsing, avoided making eye contact. Mrs. Bergen bought 12 packs of salt instead of her usual one. The Henderson family stocked up on batteries and candles like they were preparing for a blizzard. Even the teenagers seemed subdued, their usual after-school energy replaced by nervous glances toward the windows. Harvey had been adding rules almost daily. My pocket-sized list now contained 31 entries, some crossed out and rewritten, others added in different colored ink. The most recent edition appeared that morning, written in Harvey's increasingly shaky handwriting. Rule 32, October 29th, 30th, and 31st. Do not work alone. Agnes Crow Feather will assist. Follow her instructions without question. I found Agnes waiting in the parking lot when I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. She sat in an old Ford pickup that looked like it predated the Clinton administration, smoking a cigarette and watching the store entrance with the patience of someone who'd done this before. "Evening, grandson," she said, climbing out of the truck with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Ready for the real work?" "What's in the bag?" "Tools of the trade." She pulled out several items as we walked toward the store. Small bundles of dried sage, a mason jar filled with what looked like cornmeal, several pieces of carved bone, and a thermos that rattled when she moved it. "Your great-grandfather's recipe for keeping the crossing stable." "Crossing?" "The main one runs right through the center of the store, from the pharmacy section to the back wall. During the thin nights, it becomes a highway." She paused at the door while I unlocked it. "Tonight, we're traffic control." The store felt different with Agnes there. The oppressive atmosphere I'd grown accustomed to seemed lighter, like her presence was pushing back against something I couldn't see. "First thing," she said, opening her thermos and revealing a mixture of coarse salt, crushed eggshells, and something that smelled like cedar smoke. We marked the boundaries. Agnes walked the perimeter of the store, sprinkling her mixture in a thin line along the walls. She paid special attention to the corners, creating small, circular patterns that reminded me of the symbols in Thomas Whitehorse's journal. "This won't stop them," she explained as she worked, "but it'll make sure they follow the rules while they're here." "What rules?" "The original agreements. No harming the living, no permanent possession, no taking anything that isn't freely given." She completed the circuit and returned to the counter. Of course, they've gotten creative about what counts as freely given over the years. At 11:47, I locked the front door as usual. Agnes settled into a folding chair she'd brought, positioning herself where she could see both the main crossing area and the front entrance. "Now we wait," she said. The first visitor arrived at 12:15 a.m. It looked like a woman in her 40s, wearing a blue dress that might have been fashionable in the 1950s. She walked through the locked door like it was made of mist, her feet making no sound on the linoleum floor. "Evening, Margaret," Agnes called out, The woman turned toward us, and I saw that her face was translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass. Agnes, still playing gatekeeper? Still playing by the rules, I hope. Margaret smiled, an expression that was more sad than threatening. Always the rules with you people. Can't a girl just browse? Browse all you want, but no touching the merchandise and no frightening the help. The boy's not scared, Margaret said, looking directly at me. He's got the sight. Sees us for what we are, instead of what we pretend to be. She was right. Unlike the predatory creatures I'd encountered before, Margaret felt tired, worn down by decades of wandering. There was hunger in her eyes, but it was the hunger of someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like, not the predatory need I'd sensed in the others. Margaret spent 20 minutes walking the aisles, occasionally reaching toward items, but never quite touching them. When she finished, she nodded politely to Agnes and walked back through the door. One of the old crossers, Agnes explained. Been making this trip for 60 years. Died in a car accident out on Highway 212, but she keeps coming back to finish her shopping. Harmless enough. The second visitor was less harmless. It crawled through the wall near the pharmacy section around 1:30 a.m., something that might have been human once, but had been changed by decades of existing between worlds. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be, and its face was a shifting mass of features that couldn't quite decide what they wanted to look like. Agnes stood up immediately, pulling one of the carved bones from her bag. "This one doesn't follow agreements," she said quietly. "It's been feeding on the boundary itself, getting stronger." The thing oriented on us, its not quite face splitting into what might have been a grin. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor itself. "Grandmother, you're looking old. Old enough to remember when you were still mostly human, Billy Hawk." The creature's features shifted again, briefly resolving into the face of a young man before dissolving back into chaos. "Billy's long gone. I'm something better now." "You're something hungry," Agnes corrected, "and you're breaking the boundaries by feeding on them." "The boundaries are weak. The town forgot the old ways, forgot the prices that need paying. I'm just taking what's owed." Agnes raised the carved bone, and I heard her begin chanting in Lakota. The creature that had been Billy Hawk recoiled, its form becoming less stable. "The boy carries the blood," it hissed, focusing on me. "He could feed the crossing instead of guarding it, make everything stronger." "The boy knows better," Agnes replied, still chanting. "Does he?" Tyler Whitehorse, grandson of Joseph, great-grandson of Thomas. The crossing remembers your family. It remembers the promises made. The creature began moving toward us, its elongated limbs bending in ways that hurt to watch. Agnes's chanting grew louder, and the bone in her hand began glowing with soft blue light. "What promises?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. "Blood for passage," the thing that had been Billy Hawk whispered. "A life freely given to maintain the balance. Your great-grandfather made the deal. Your grandfather honored it. Your father tried to run from it." The words hit me like a physical blow. My father's death hadn't been a heart attack at 53. It had been something else, something connected to this place and these creatures. "Lies," Agnes said firmly, but I caught the hesitation in her voice. "Ask her about the real Rule 1, the creature suggested. Ask her why there are always white horsemen working the crossing points. Ask her why Harvey needed someone with the blood." Agnes's chanting reached a crescendo, and the bone in her hand flared bright enough to cast shadows across the entire store. The creature shrieked and began dissolving, its form breaking apart like smoke in wind. "This isn't over," it managed, before disappearing entirely. "The debt comes due on Halloween night." The store fell silent, except for the hum of refrigerated cases and the distant sound of wind against the windows. Agnes lowered the bone, her hands shaking slightly. "Grandson, is it true?" She was quiet for a long time, studying the place where the creature had vanished. "There are things your family never told you, things they hoped you'd never need to know. But I need to know them now." Agnes returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 70-something years. The original agreement required a guardian for each crossing point, someone with the sight, someone connected to the old ways. The job, it changes people, wears them down. And the blood debt? Insurance. If the guardian fails, if the crossing becomes unstable, someone from the bloodline has to step in, permanently. The rest of the night passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the creature's words or the weight of Agnes's revelation. I was part of a system I'd never agreed to join, carrying a debt I'd never contracted. When Harvey arrived at 6 a.m., he took one look at both of us and seemed to understand what had happened. "Billy Hawk finally showed himself," he said. It wasn't a question. "He's stronger than before," Agnes replied, "feeding on the boundary energy. Halloween night, he's going to make a play for permanent access." Harvey nodded grimly. "Then we'd better make sure Tyler's ready." As I drove home, the morning sun doing little to warm the October chill, I realized that everything I'd learned about faith and the Dollar Tree had been preparation for something I was only beginning to understand. Halloween was 2 days away, and apparently, my family's debt was coming due. I spent Halloween morning at the cemetery where my father was buried, staring at his headstone and trying to reconcile the man I remembered with the guardian Agnes had described. Robert Whitehorse, 1970 to 2023, beloved son and father. The inscription said nothing about supernatural deaths or boundary crossings. "You could have told me," I said to the granite marker. "Could have prepared me for this." The wind picked up, rustling the dried leaves that had gathered around the grave. For a moment, I thought I heard something in that sound. Not quite words, but something like an apology. My phone buzzed. Text from Agnes. "Meet me at the high school. Need to show you something before tonight." Faith High School sat on the north edge of town, a brick building from the 1960s that housed maybe 200 students on a good day. Agnes waited in the parking lot, her old pickup truck loaded with supplies, more salt, bundles of sage, and several items I didn't recognize. "Your great-grandfather's journal mentioned 3 crossing points in Faith," she said without preamble. "The main one under the Dollar Tree, a smaller one here at the school, and the largest one under what used to be the old church." "Used to be?" "Burned down in 1987, same night as Peterson's 5 and Dine. Town rebuilt it as a community center, but they've built it wrong. Blocked the crossing instead of channeling it." She pointed across the street to a modern building that looked like it belonged in a strip mall. "That's where Billy Hawk is gathering his strength." We walked to the school's back entrance, where Agnes produced a key that looked older than the building itself. "Principal Martinez understands the situation," she explained. "Her grandmother was there in 1923 when the original agreements were made." The high school felt empty and hollow, the way schools always do after hours. But underneath that familiar stillness, I sensed something else. A current of energy running through the building, like water through underground pipes. Agnes led me to the gymnasium, where someone had painted a large circle on the floor in what looked like white paint, but smelled like crushed bone and sage. "Secondary crossing," she said. "Smaller than the one at your store. but it connects to the same network. Tonight, when the barrier gets thin, all 3 points will sync up. And that's when Billy Hawk makes his move. He's been feeding on boundary energy for months, getting stronger. Tonight, he's going to try to tear the crossings wide open. Permanent access for anything that wants to come through. Agnes opened her bag and pulled out Thomas Whitehorse's journal, turning to a page I hadn't seen before. The sketch showed 3 circles connected by lines, with symbols marking specific locations around each circle. The original guardians, she said, pointing to the symbols. 3 families, 3 bloodlines, 3 crossing points. The Whitehorses, the Martinez family, and the Crow Feathers. Your family guards a crossing too? The school crossing. Been doing it for 100 years. She smiled grimly. Why do you think I know so much about your situation? And the Martinez family? Community center. But Elena Martinez died last winter, and her daughter moved to Denver. No guardian there anymore. The pieces were starting to fit together in a pattern I didn't like. So the community center crossing is unguarded. Has been for 10 months. That's why Billy Hawk is so strong now. He's been feeding off an unprotected boundary. Agnes walked to the painted circle and began placing small objects at specific points. Carved bones, bundles of herbs, stones that looked like they'd been polished by decades of handling. Tonight, we're going to stabilize all 3 crossings simultaneously. Me here, you at the Dollar Tree, and... She paused, looking uncomfortable. And... someone needs to be at the community center. Someone with the sight and the blood. There's no one else? There's you. I stared at her, understanding dawning like cold water in my stomach. You want me to guard 2 crossings at once? The community center crossing will only be active for about an hour, from 11 p.m. to midnight. If we can keep it stable during that window, Billy Hawk won't be able to use it as an anchor point. And if we can't? Agnes didn't answer immediately. She finished placing her objects around the circle, each one seeming to hum with barely contained energy. If we can't, faith becomes a permanent gateway. Every hungry spirit, every lost soul, every predator that exists between worlds will have direct access to our reality. Great, no pressure. We spent the next 2 hours going over the plan. I would start my shift at the Dollar Tree as usual, following the established routine until 10:45 p.m. Then I'd slip out the back exit and drive to the community center, where Agnes had already placed the necessary protective items. At 11 p.m. sharp, I'd activate the temporary boundary stabilization spell she'd taught me. At midnight, I'd return to the Dollar Tree for the real confrontation with Billy Hawk. The spell won't hold for long, Agnes warned, and you'll be vulnerable while you're casting it. If Billy Hawk realizes what we're doing, he'll come for me first. Probably. Agnes drove me back to the Dollar Tree around 8 p.m., giving me time to prepare for what was likely to be the longest night of my life. Harvey was waiting in the parking lot, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. You sure about this, Tyler? He asked. There might be another way. What other way? Harvey looked older than I'd ever seen him, like the weight of decades was finally catching up. The blood debt. It doesn't have to be you who pays it. What do you mean? I've been guarding this crossing for 37 years, seen 3 generations of Whitehorses come and go. Maybe it's time for someone else to take the permanent shift. I understood what he was offering, and it made my chest tight with gratitude and horror in equal measure. Harvey, no, this isn't your responsibility. Isn't it? I hired you knowing what it meant. Knew your bloodline. Knew what Billy Hawk would eventually demand. He handed me the key to the store, his fingers shaking slightly. If something goes wrong tonight, if the spell doesn't work, remember that there's always a choice about who pays the price. Inside the store, I went through my normal opening routine with mechanical precision. Count the register, check the inventory sheets, review the rules. But tonight, the rules felt different. Not like guidelines for survival, but like a ritual I was performing for the last time. At 10:30, the first Halloween customers began arriving. A family with young kids, buying last-minute candy. Teenagers picking up toilet paper and shaving cream for pranks they thought were rebellious. An elderly couple purchasing batteries for their flashlights. Normal people doing normal things, completely unaware that their world might change forever in the next few hours. At 10:45, I locked the front door and slipped out the back exit. The drive to the community center took 7 minutes. 7 minutes during which anything could have entered the unguarded Dollar Tree. The community center squatted on Main Street like a concrete toad, its modern architecture a jarring contrast to the historic buildings around it. Agnes had left a duffel bag hidden behind the dumpster, filled with the items I'd need for the stabilization spell. Inside, the building felt wrong. Not actively malevolent like the Dollar Tree could be, but hollow. Like something important had been carved out of the space and never replaced. I found the spot Agnes had marked. Dead center of what used to be the church's altar, now covered by industrial carpeting and fluorescent lighting. The crossing was invisible to normal sight, but I could feel it like a wound in the air. At exactly 11 p.m., I began the ritual Agnes had taught me. The words were in Makota, phrases my great-grandfather had written in his journal, but that felt familiar on my tongue, like genetic memory made audible. As I spoke, I scattered the mixture of salt, cornmeal, and crushed sage in a wide circle around the crossing point. The effect was immediate. The air above the carpet began to shimmer like heat waves, and I could see through it too. Somewhere else. A vast prairie under a starless sky, with figures moving in the distance like shadows given form. That's when Billy Hawk found me. He didn't appear gradually this time. One moment I was alone in the community center. The next he was standing at the edge of my protective circle, his form more solid and defined than I'd ever seen it. "Clever boy," he said, his voice echoing from multiple directions at once. "But you can't guard 3 crossings with 2 people. Watch me." "I am watching. I'm also watching your friend Agnes struggle at the school. Did she tell you what happens when a guardian fails?" Billy Hawk gestured, and the air shimmered again. This time I saw the high school gymnasium, where Agnes knelt inside her painted circle, while dark shapes pressed against the boundaries she'd created. She was chanting, but I could see exhaustion in every line of her body. "She's been doing this for 50 years, Billy Hawk continued conversationally. "The crossing work ages you faster than normal time. Look at her hands." I looked and saw that Agnes's hands were translucent, like Margaret's had been. She was becoming more spirit than flesh, worn down by decades of boundary work. "That's what the guardian job really means," Billy Hawk said. "Slow consumption. Your great-grandfather lasted 20 years. Your grandfather managed 15. Your father tried to run, so the crossing took him all at once." "You're lying." "Am I?" "Check your family photos when you get home. Look at how your great-grandfather aged in the last 5 years of his life. Look at your grandfather's medical records. Heart failure at 48, just like your father." The ritual circle I was maintaining began to waver as doubt crept into my concentration. Billy Hawk smiled, his features briefly resolving into the face of the young man he'd been before the crossing changed him. "I'm not the monster here, Tyler. The crossing is. It's been feeding on your family for a century, and it's never going to stop." He took a step closer to the circle's edge. "But I can end it. Let me tear the boundaries wide open. Let the crossings merge permanently, and no one else has to be consumed one piece at a time. And let every predator in the spirit world have access to faith. Some prices are worth paying to end a greater evil. For a moment, I almost believed him. The alternative, watching my life drain away year by year, the same way it had drained from Agnes and my father and grandfather, seemed worse than whatever chaos Billy Hawk might unleash. Then I remembered the 3 synchronized entities from the Dollar Tree, their hungry black eyes and predatory amusement. I remembered the thing that had worn Harvey's voice to lure me into the storage room. "No," I said, pouring more energy into the stabilization spell. "Find another way." Billy Hawk's expression hardened. "Then you'll pay the price your family owes. Tonight." He lunged forward, hitting the boundary of my protective circle like a physical force. The impact sent shockwaves through the air, and I felt something inside me tear as I struggled to maintain the spell. Midnight was still 15 minutes away. I had to hold the crossing stable until then, no matter what Billy Hawk threw at me. The real fight was just beginning. Billy Hawk's assault on my protective circle came in waves. First physical force that made the air crack like breaking glass, then psychological pressure that felt like ice picks driven into my skull. Each attack weakened the stabilization spell, and I could feel the community center crossing growing unstable beneath my feet. 12 minutes, I muttered, checking my watch while trying to maintain the Lakota chant Agnes had taught me. Just hold for 12 more minutes. Billy Hawk circled the boundary like a predator testing a fence, his form shifting between the young man he'd been and the twisted thing he'd become. You feel it, don't you? The crossing pulling at your life force. Every second you maintain this spell, it takes a little more of you. He was right. My hands had developed the same translucent quality I'd seen in Agnes, and there was a hollow ache in my chest that hadn't been there an hour ago. The guardian work wasn't just demanding, it was consuming me. Better to burn out fast than fade away slow, Billy Hawk continued. Let me end this, Tyler. Let me tear the boundaries open and free your family from this curse. What about the people in faith? What happens to them when every hungry spirit in the region can walk through town like it's their personal feeding ground? Collateral damage. Your family has been paying the price for this town's safety for a century. Maybe it's time the town paid its own bills. The community center crossing pulsed beneath me, sending tremors through the building's foundation. Dust rained from the ceiling tiles, and somewhere in the distance I heard car alarms going off as the spiritual disturbance rippled outward. My phone buzzed. Text from Agnes. School crossing stabilized. Need help. I couldn't spare the energy to text back, but her message gave me hope. One crossing secure, one holding, one more to go. At 11:55, Billy Hawk changed tactics. Instead of attacking the protective circle directly, he began pulling power from the crossing itself, drawing the spiritual energy upward like a twisted reverse whirlpool. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The shimmer in the air became a gaping wound, and through it, I could see dozens of figures gathering on the other side. Not just lost spirits or hungry shadows. These were things that had never been human, entities with too many limbs and faces that couldn't decide what shape they wanted to hold. They pressed against the barrier between worlds, sensing the weakness Billy Hawk was creating. "You see?" Billy Hawk said, his voice now coming from everywhere at once. "The crossing wants to be opened. It's tired of being constrained, tired of being rationed and controlled. Let it be what it was meant to be." The protective circle I'd drawn began to crack, literally. Hairline fractures appeared in the industrial carpeting, spreading outward from the crossing point like a spider web. Through those cracks, I could see the same starless prairie I'd glimpsed before, but now it was crowded with waiting predators. 2 minutes until midnight, 2 minutes until I could abandon the spell and race back to the Dollar Tree for the final confrontation. That's when I heard my father's voice. Tyler, clear and calm, coming from directly behind me. Son, you need to listen. I turned, nearly losing control of the stabilization spell, and saw him standing at the edge of the community center's main room. Robert Whitehorse looked exactly as I remembered. Work shirt, jeans, the same serious expression he'd worn when teaching me to change a tire or balance a checkbook. Dad? Don't let Billy Hawk fool you, he said, moving closer. The guardian job doesn't have to consume you. There's another way. Billy Hawk snarled, his form becoming less stable. Impossible. You're dead. The crossing took you years ago. The crossing took my body, my father agreed, but it couldn't take my choice, and it can't take Tyler's choice either. My father walked to the edge of my protective circle, and I saw that he cast no shadow on the floor. The blood debt isn't about dying for the crossing, son. It's about living for it, becoming part of the boundary between worlds. What does that mean? It means you don't have to fight the guardian work. You can embrace it, let it change you gradually, instead of all at once. Agnes has been doing it wrong for 50 years, fighting the consumption instead of directing it. Billy Hawk lunged forward again, but this time my father stepped between us. The two spirits collided in a flash of silver light that left afterimages burned across my vision. Now, Tyler, my father shouted. While he's distracted. I poured every remaining bit of energy into the stabilization spell, feeling something fundamental shift in my relationship with the crossing. Instead of fighting its pull on my life force, I began channeling that energy back into the boundary itself, creating a feedback loop that strengthened both me and the spiritual barrier. The effect was immediate. The cracks in the floor sealed themselves, the shimmer in the air stabilized, and the hungry entities on the other side retreated from what had become an impermeable wall. At exactly midnight, the community center crossing went dormant, sealed until next Halloween. Billy Hawk separated from my father, both spirits flickering like dying candle flames. This isn't over, he snarled. The Dollar Tree crossing is still active, still vulnerable. Then I guess I'd better get back there, I said, grabbing Agnes's duffel bag and heading for the exit. Tyler, my father called out. Remember what I showed you. The crossing doesn't have to be your enemy. I nodded and ran for my truck, leaving two spirits to finish whatever battle had been brewing between them for years. The drive back to the Dollar Tree took 6 minutes that felt like hours. The store's parking lot was empty, but every light inside was blazing, and I could see dark shapes moving through the aisles like sharks circling in an aquarium. Harvey's truck sat beside the building, which meant he'd come back despite my orders to stay away. I found him inside, standing behind the counter with a shotgun across his knees and a grim expression on his weathered face. Couldn't stay home, he said without looking up. This is my responsibility too. The store was full of them, at least a dozen entities of various sizes and malevolence, all drawn by the Halloween thinning of the boundary, but they weren't attacking. They were waiting. Where's Billy Hawk? I asked. Storage room, Harvey replied. Been back there for 20 minutes, doing something to the main crossing point. Whatever it is, it's making the whole building shake. As if summoned by his words, a tremor ran through the Dollar Tree, rattling products off the shelves and making the fluorescent lights flicker. In the storage room, I could hear Billy Hawk chanting in a language that predated human civilization. He's trying to tear the crossing wide open, I realized. Permanent access, just like he threatened. Harvey stood up, checking the shotgun's load. Rock salt and sage, he said. Won't kill him, but it'll hurt enough to get his attention. Harvey, no. This is what he wants. For one of us to come back there and disrupt whatever protection the storage room still has. So what do you suggest? I thought about my father's words, about embracing the guardian work instead of fighting it, about Agnes' slowly translucent hands and the price my family had been paying for a century. I'm going to try something different. I walked to the center of the store, where the main crossing ran beneath the pharmacy and automotive sections. The other entities in the aisles watched me with hungry curiosity, but none of them moved to interfere. Kneeling on the linoleum floor, I placed my hands flat against the surface and reached out with the same spiritual sense I'd used at the community center. The crossing was there, deep and powerful, but instead of trying to control it or protect myself from it, I opened myself to its influence. The sensation was like diving into a river of liquid starlight. Power flowed through me, around me, transforming me on a cellular level. I felt my connection to the physical world loosening, but instead of fighting it, I used that looseness to merge partially with the crossing itself. From this new perspective, I could see the entire spiritual ecosystem of faith. The 3 crossing points, the network of protective spells Agnes and her predecessors had woven, the scars left by decades of supernatural activity. And I could see Billy Hawk in the storage room, his form blazing with stolen energy as he tried to tear reality apart. I reached through the crossing and grabbed him. Billy Hawk screamed as I pulled him away from his sabotage and into direct contact with the crossing's core. For a moment, we were both suspended in that river of starlight, 2 spirits grappling for control of forces neither of us fully understood. "You can't stop me," he snarled, his form shifting between human and monster. "I've been feeding on boundary energy for months. I'm stronger than any guardian." "You're not fighting a guardian," I replied, feeling the crossing's power flow through my words. "You're fighting the crossing itself." I pressed deeper into the spiritual current, letting it transform me further. My physical body became a distant concern as I embraced my role as a living conduit between worlds. Billy Hawk fought back, but he was trying to dominate something that was meant to be partnered with, not conquered. The river of starlight swept him away, carrying his screaming form back to whatever realm had spawned him. As he disappeared, the stolen energy he'd accumulated dispersed back into the natural flow of the crossing. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the Dollar Tree floor, surrounded by Harvey and Agnes, who must have arrived while I was merged with the crossing. The other entities had vanished, driven back to their own realm by the restoration of the natural boundary. "How do you feel?" Agnes asked, helping me sit up. I took inventory. My hands were still slightly translucent, but the hollow ache in my chest had been replaced by something that felt like completion, like I'd found a missing piece of myself. "Different," I said honestly, "but not consumed, not dying." Harvey smiled, the first genuine expression of relief I'd seen from him in weeks. "Your father figured it out, didn't he? How to be a guardian without being destroyed by the work." I nodded, understanding finally settling into place. The blood debt had never been about death. It had been about transformation, about choosing to become something more than human in order to protect the boundary between worlds. As the sun rose over Faith, painting the prairie grass gold, I realized that my night shift at the Dollar Tree was just beginning. 3 weeks after Halloween, I was still learning what it meant to be a living bridge between worlds. The physical changes were subtle but consistent. My reflection moved a half second behind my actual movements, like watching myself through water. Food had lost most of its taste, though I still needed to eat. Sleep came in fragments. Sometimes I'd dream of walking through the starlight river that connected all the crossing points, Sometimes I'd wake up standing in places I didn't remember going to. But the strangest part was the knowledge that came with the transformation. I understood things now that I'd never been taught. Which spirits were lost versus which ones were hunting. How to read the currents of spiritual energy that flowed beneath faith, like underground streams. Why certain combinations of salt and sage created barriers, while others opened doorways. Agnes visited the store every few days, ostensibly to buy groceries, but really to check on my adaptation. She looked healthier than she had in months, the translucence in her hands fading as her own crossing work became less taxing. Sharing the load makes it easier for all of us, she explained during one of her visits. The crossing network was designed for cooperation, not individual sacrifice. Is that why my family kept burning out? They were trying to handle too much alone? Your great-grandfather understood the cooperative model, but after he died, the knowledge got fragmented. Your grandfather and father only knew pieces of the system. She selected a can of peaches from the shelf, examining the label with the careful attention she gave everything these days. Harvey's been carrying more of the burden than he should have, too. Harvey had indeed seemed more relaxed since Halloween. The constant worry lines around his eyes had softened, and he'd started talking about maybe taking a real vacation for the first time in decades. You thinking about retiring? I asked him during one of our shift changes. Thinking about it. There's a fishing cabin up near Lake Oahe that's been calling my name for 20 years. He paused, studying my face with the same careful attention Agnes gave her shopping. But only if you're sure you can handle things here. I'm learning. You're doing more than learning. You're changing the whole dynamic. Harvey gestured toward the store, where the atmosphere had shifted from oppressive watchfulness to something more like equilibrium. The crossing's not fighting us anymore. It's working with us. He was right. The nightly encounters that had terrified me for months now felt like conversations with difficult neighbors rather than battles for survival. Lost spirits still passed through, but they followed the established patterns instead of testing boundaries. The predatory entities that had stalked the aisles stayed away entirely, repelled by the cooperative energy flowing between the crossing and its guardian. Even the rules had evolved. Harvey's original list of 32 survival tactics had been replaced by something more flexible, a set of guidelines that adapted to each situation rather than rigid commands to be followed blindly. I still locked the door at 11:47, but now it was because that timing aligned with the crossing's natural rhythms rather than fear of what might try to enter. The phone still rang 3 times before going silent, but I'd learned it was the crossing's way of announcing incoming spiritual traffic. Instead of unplugging it, I'd started using those moments to prepare for whatever was about to arrive. On a quiet Tuesday night in mid-November, I discovered one of the more unsettling aspects of my new existence. I was restocking the greeting cards in aisle 7, the ones that had been rearranging themselves since my first week, when I noticed a customer I hadn't heard enter. A middle-aged man in a winter coat, standing near the pharmacy section with his back to me. Something about his posture seemed familiar, but I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. I watched him for several minutes, noting that he wasn't actually shopping, just standing there, perfectly still like he was waiting for something. "Can I help you find anything?" I called out. The man turned around and I found myself looking at my own face. Not a resemblance, not a family similarity. My exact face, down to the scar on my left cheek from a childhood bicycle accident. But this other me had eyes that held depths I didn't recognize, and when he smiled, it was with knowledge I hadn't earned. "Hello, Tyler," he said in my own voice. "We need to talk." I've seen enough supernatural weirdness over the past few months that meeting myself didn't send me into complete panic. But it definitely made the back of my neck prickle with unease. Let me guess, you're from the future, here to warn me about some terrible mistake I'm about to make. The other Tyler laughed, the same laugh I heard when I found something genuinely funny, not the polite chuckle I used for customers' bad jokes. Nothing so dramatic. I'm from about 6 months ahead of where you are now. The crossing sometimes shows us glimpses of where our choices lead. And you're here because in 3 days, you're going to get an offer that seems like the solution to all your problems. A way to normalize your life, reduce the spiritual burden, maybe even return to something resembling your old existence. Future Tyler walked closer, and I could see that his reflection moved normally, unlike mine. His hands looked fully solid, no translucence at all. I'm assuming you took that offer. I did, and I've been regretting it ever since. He gestured around the store, which looked exactly the same to me, but seemed to cause him distress. The crossing doesn't just need a guardian, Tyler. It needs someone who chooses to be part of the system willingly, who embraces the transformation instead of fighting it. What happens if we normalize? The crossing adapts, finds another way to maintain the boundary, but it becomes hungrier, more demanding. Instead of cooperative partnership, it goes back to consumption. Future Tyler's expression darkened. Agnes dies within a year. Harvey has a stroke trying to compensate for the increased spiritual load. And Faith becomes a feeding ground for everything we've been keeping out. I stared at my future self, trying to process the implications. So the offer will come from someone who seems to understand your situation perfectly. They'll have credentials, references, maybe even claim to represent other guardian families. They'll offer you a way to reduce the spiritual burden while still maintaining the boundary. But it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way, Future Tyler confirmed. The crossing requires commitment, not convenience. Half measures create vulnerabilities that predators like Billy Hawk can exploit. He began walking toward the front of the store, becoming less solid with each step. The choice is yours, obviously. But I wanted you to know what the stakes really are. Wait, I called out. How do I know you're really from the future and not just another spirit trying to manipulate me? Future Tyler paused at the door, his form already translucent enough that I could see the parking lot through his body. Because I know that you've been wondering if Dad's death was really natural, and I know you found the medical examiner's report hidden in his bedroom closet. Heart failure caused by unexplained spiritual trauma. The medical report I'd discovered 2 days ago. The one I hadn't told anyone about. The one that confirmed Agnes's story about the crossing consuming guardians who fought the transformation instead of accepting it. The crossing didn't kill him, Tyler. His refusal to work with it did. Future Tyler faded away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet hum of the refrigerated cases. 3 days later, the offer came exactly as he'd predicted. Dr. Sarah Blackbird introduced herself as a researcher, specializing in indigenous spiritual practices and their modern applications. She had impeccable credentials, PhD in anthropology from the University of South Dakota, published papers on Lakota ceremonial traditions, recommendations from tribal elders I actually recognized. She also knew far too much about my situation. The guardian system is fascinating, she said, sitting across from me in the diner where we'd agreed to meet. A sustainable model for managing supernatural boundaries that most cultures never achieved, but it's also unnecessarily demanding on individual practitioners. Demanding how? The spiritual integration process you've undergone, the partial transformation that allows you to interface with the crossing directly. It's effective, but it's also irreversible and increasingly isolating. Dr. Blackbird opened a leather portfolio filled with documents and photographs. My research suggests there are ways to maintain the boundary system while preserving your essential humanity. The photographs showed other people in situations similar to mine: night shift workers at gas stations, security guards at hospitals, lighthouse keepers on isolated coastlines. All of them appeared to be managing supernatural boundaries, but they looked normal, fully human, unaffected by the spiritual transformation I was experiencing. How? Technological augmentation of traditional protective methods. Devices that can channel and focus spiritual energy without requiring the operator to merge with it directly. She showed me what looked like a wristwatch covered in carved symbols. This particular model was developed in cooperation with Ojibwe spiritual leaders in Minnesota. It allows the wearer to interact with boundary crossings while maintaining complete human physiology. The device was tempting. The idea of returning to normal sleep, normal food, normal reflections was incredibly appealing. But future Tyler's warning echoed in my mind. What's the catch? No catch. Just a different approach to the same goal. Dr. Blackbird smiled, but something about her expression reminded me of the predatory entities I'd learned to recognize. The guardian work doesn't have to consume your humanity, Tyler. It can enhance it instead. I thought about Agnes's gradually solidifying hands, Harvey's plans for retirement, the cooperative energy that now flowed through the Dollar Tree instead of desperate survival tactics. "Thank you for the offer," I said, standing up from the diner booth. "But I think I'll stick with the traditional approach." Dr. Blackbird's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something hungry underneath. "Are you sure? This might be your only chance to reclaim a normal life." "I'm sure." As I walked back to my truck, I caught Dr. Blackbird's reflection in the diner window. She was sitting exactly where I'd left her, but her reflection was standing up, watching me leave with eyes that had too much depth and not enough humanity. Some offers, I realized, are tests disguised as opportunities, and some tests are worth failing on purpose. 1 year later, Harvey retired in March, just as the prairie started showing its first hints of green. He handed over the store keys with a grin I'd never seen before, the expression of a man who'd carried a burden for 40 years and finally found someone trustworthy enough to share it. "Take care of the place," he said, loading his fishing gear into a truck that looked suspiciously new. "But don't let it take care of you." I understood what he meant now. The difference between being consumed by the guardian work and being transformed by it came down to choice. The daily decision to partner with the crossing instead of fighting it or surrendering to it completely. Agnes stopped by that evening, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I made in a week. "Celebration," she said, settling into the folding chair she'd left behind the counter. "First time in 50 years I've had a true partner in this work, instead of someone I was trying to keep alive." "How's the school crossing?" "Quiet. Cooperative. The spirits know we're working together now, so they follow the old agreements instead of testing boundaries." She poured wine into 2 coffee mugs, the only drinking vessels the store had to offer. "Your sister called me yesterday." I paused in the middle of updating inventory sheets. Marlena had been calling less frequently since my transformation began, our conversations becoming stilted and strange as the gulf between our realities widened. What did she want? To know if you were still human. Agnes sipped her wine, studying my face over the rim of her mug. "I told her you were more human than you'd ever been. Just not the same kind of human you used to be." That was probably the most accurate description of my current existence. I still had thoughts and feelings and memories, still cared about the same things I'd always cared about. But I also had awareness that extended beyond the physical world, responsibilities that connected me to spiritual currents flowing beneath reality's surface. My reflection had synchronized with my movements around the 6-month mark. Food started tasting normal again around the same time, though I needed less of it than before. Sleep remained fragmentary, but the dreams were no longer disorienting. They were information, updates from the crossing network that stretched across the Great Plains. The customer base had evolved too. During daylight hours, the Dollar Tree served Faith's normal population, ranchers buying motor oil, families stocking up on school supplies, teenagers spending allowance money on candy and energy drinks. But at night, the store attracted a different clientele. Lost spirits still came through, but now they moved with purpose instead of confusion. The crossing had stabilized enough that most of them knew exactly where they were going and what they needed to do to get there. My job had shifted from survival to traffic management, making sure the spiritual travelers didn't interfere with each other or linger too long in the physical realm. Occasionally, something genuinely dangerous would test the boundaries. A hungry entity looking for easy prey, or a predator that hadn't gotten the message about Faith's new defensive arrangements. But these encounters felt less like life or death battles and more like a bouncer dealing with troublemakers. The crossing itself had become an active partner in maintaining order. The rules had evolved into something more like guidelines, flexible principles that adapted to each situation rather than rigid commandments. I still kept Harvey's original list in my shirt pocket, but more as a reminder of how far we'd all come than as actual instructions. Agnes finished her wine and gathered her things to leave. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, pausing at the door. "He always hoped someone in your bloodline would figure out the cooperative approach." After she left, I walked through the empty store, checking that day shift had properly stocked the shelves and organized the displays. Normal retail work, but performed by someone who could sense the spiritual currents flowing beneath Faith like underground rivers. At 11:47, I locked the front door and prepared for another night of maintaining the boundary between worlds. The crossing hummed quietly in the background, a sound like distant singing that only I could hear. Tomorrow, my replacement would arrive for the day shift, Harvey's nephew, a recent college graduate who thought he was just taking a retail job to pay off student loans. I'd train him the same way Harvey had trained me, starting with the basics and gradually introducing him to Faith's deeper mysteries. The cycle would continue, but now it was a choice instead of a curse. And that, I'd learned, made all the difference.